It is time to turn our attention to the sort of most, I think, testable and concrete specific section of the corporate governance learning module, where we will discuss corporate mechanisms as they apply to different stakeholder groups, most notably shareholders and directors, or the board of directors. So a lot of specific stuff here to memorize and learn. Let's just begin with a general note that it is absolutely essential, according to the curriculum, to good corporate governance, the idea of corporate reporting, right? So the company publishing various publicly available information and being transparent about what's going on. So this is absolutely essential, according to the curriculum, to good governance. Why? Because it allows external stakeholders, for example, shareholders, but also regulators, also employees, debt holders, to assess company performance and the company's financial position. And of course, most of the time, corporate reporting and transparency is achieved via various, published information. So in the case of public companies, they are typically required to make public their financial reports, but also various items of non-financial information. So we've got, annual reports, we've got proxy statements, we've got additional disclosures, for example, pertaining to transactions in shares as done by directors of the business. And stock exchanges where these companies are listed will always, well, not always, but most of the time, mandate that the financial statements be audited by an external auditor. We also have, of course, private companies where the situation is quite different, because there is no external requirement necessarily to publish financial statements, or actually it depends on the country. Some countries do require smaller, non-public companies to publish some spectrum of financial information, although it will be typically very limited compared to what public companies do. The additional disclosure in the form of notes will not necessarily be there. So most of the time, the disclosure is only to shareholders, that is the owners of the business, and also, the content of that disclosure, its level of detail, for example, will be subject to negotiation between the shareholder and the company itself. Right. Okay. So that's a bit of let's say introduction. And now we go to the sort of core of the lesson, which are the mechanisms for corporate governance. So what are the ways in which corporate governance is actually exercised or executed? Well, let's start. As I said, we'll be going through the different stakeholder groups. So shareholders come first. These are so-called shareholder mechanisms as the sort of classic most important stakeholder group. And the most important way in which shareholders exercise their rights to have a say is at the shareholder meeting. This meeting may take on two forms. The first is your classic so-called AGM, which obviously stands for Annual General Meeting. This is, depending on where you are in the world, there may be different practices with regard to this. Where I live in Europe, these meetings for publicly available companies typically take place somewhere around late spring, early summer, like May or June. And at the annual general meeting, all the shareholders have an opportunity to vote. That is, exercise one of the most fundamental rights associated with holding common shares, to vote on issues, on matters that have not been delegated to the board of directors, because on a day-to-day basis, the shareholders are not required to actually vote on various company-related issues. The board of directors and the management take care of that, but some things are important enough to be delegated to the to not be delegated to the board of directors, and this gets voted on during the AGM. Plus, the AGM is also an opportunity for shareholders to voice their opinion, opportunity to participate in discussion concerning various company-related matters. So I guess you need to know a little bit about the typical business of the AGM, what it is that we vote on during the AGM, or shareholders vote on. Well, they need to elect board members. Of course, board members do not elect themselves. It's the shareholders who elect members of the board. They are also supposed to elect or select the external auditor. The job of the auditor is to check the company's financial statements, and because the financial statements are prepared by the directors, it shouldn't be the directors who are choosing the checker, the verifier, the auditor. It should be the shareholders, and they need to approve their compensation, approval of their compensation. That typically gets voted on during the AGM. And another point is actually approving the financial statements. So saying, kind of casting a vote that you really believe that the financial statements are a reliable source of information about company position, company performance. It's not whether you like the financial statements in the sense that you like the profit or you dislike the loss. It's whether you trust the financial statements to show a fair view of what's going on in the business. Statements, and in some countries, not everywhere, but for example in places like Germany, or where I come from, Poland, the shareholders also vote on how the profits, if there are profits, should be split. What portion of it should be allocated to the payment of dividend, and what portion should stay in the business and be retained. In places like the UK or the US, this is actually delegated to the board of directors. It's them who decide on that split. So this is country specific, but typically everywhere also the shareholders are asked to approve directors' pay packages, so compensation packages, so approval of director compensation. And there are other things that also get voted on. I don't think you need to know everything, especially as it is going to be very jurisdiction specific. Now, something that you definitely do need to know is the fact that aside from the classic AGM, annual general meeting, shareholders may also be invited to participate in what's known as the EGM, which is the extraordinary general meeting. And this, there is nothing regular about this one being called, this one being convened. It is, after all, something extraordinary. You would convene it, so this is convened when either the directors need shareholders' approval for something which is quite important, and the directors cannot take that decision themselves. So shareholder approval is needed for some matter, for some so-called resolution, something to be voted on, or it may be because the shareholders themselves have requested such an extraordinary meeting, or requested by shareholders themselves. Although, in order for this second latter case to actually, for this latter reason to result in an extraordinary meeting, there typically needs to be some substantial block of shareholders representing a certain, percentage of shares of voting rights. So it's not like everybody has the power to convene such a meeting or make it happen just because they want to. Now, the typical matters which we will see being the subject of discussion in an extraordinary meeting are, a special election of board members, especially when it's being proposed by shareholders. So if they are dissatisfied with the existing board, whose composition was approved at the AGM, they may want to replace them and hold a vote at an extraordinary meeting without waiting until the full year is over and the next AGM happens. Maybe there will need to be, or we think there need to be, amendments to the Articles of Association. That is the legal document that kind of outlines the rules according to which a company functions, or the so-called bylaws of the business. Now, these names are very sort of jurisdiction specific, but it's some change to the statute of the company, its primary rules of operation. There may be a need to vote on mergers and acquisitions, takeovers, a takeover proposal, or maybe a substantial sale of assets of the business. So asset sales, maybe the need to do a capital increase. So capital increases, and another one, although quite, quite drastic, is voluntary liquidation, where the shareholders decide just to take the company apart and liquidate it instead of continuing to function. So very important is the way that shareholders can exercise their vote during these meetings. Shareholders may either attend in person, so physically go to the meeting, which doesn't happen as often as it used to be, as it used to in the past, or as an alternative, authorize somebody else to vote on their behalf. Authorize another party to vote on their behalf. And the second method of exercising your sort of voting power is called proxy voting, and this is something you absolutely need to know. This term proxy voting, this can happen electronically, this can happen by mail, traditional sort of document, but typically these days you authorize somebody else electronically and they vote on your behalf. There are actually special companies that's ideally just specialize in providing this kind of service. Okay, a few additional terms when it comes to, a few additional ideas when it comes to these the rights of shareholders and the mechanisms which they use. So this was shareholder meetings, and now some additional categories of mechanisms. First of all, shareholder activism. Obviously, all of this is related because a lot of the activism also happens via meetings. But this is an attempt or attempting to, I guess, change the way in which the company functions, attempting to compel, kind of force the company to act in a desired way. in a desired way. And when you study alternative investments, especially hedge funds, you will perhaps see and appreciate that one of the hedge fund strategies we discuss is activist investing. This is exactly the same thing. Now, why would you attempt to, make a company act in a specific way that you want? Well, typically because you want to increase company value, so you think that way is going to bring about positive change in terms of shareholder wealth and company value. But you may also be doing it for sort of social, environmental, political reasons as well, which may be sort of further away from any financial perspective of financial gain. And as I said, hedge funds are often big activist investors or activists. The reason why they can afford to be big activists is because hedge funds can build up big positions in shares because they often use leverage, so they borrow money so as to be able to purchase on a bigger scale. And unlike normal sort of mutual funds, they don't face as many restrictions concerning concentration ratios. So they can go in big time into companies, assume large positions, and that can, result in them having a big influence, a big sway over how the company is being managed, or at least a loud voice. Now, another mechanism, so, this is already the third one, because we started with the shareholder meeting. Okay, then we said there's shareholder activism, and now a third mechanism of governance as exercised by shareholders is something called shareholder litigation. And this, as you may kind of infer from the name, it's all about lawsuits being brought on by shareholders against, typically against the board of directors, against the management of the company, against the controlling shareholder. And your book mentions a specific example of this. Of course, the way in which shareholder litigation may actually be performed will typically be country jurisdiction specific, but a name that I think is bolded even in your curriculum, so it is important, is something called the shareholder derivative lawsuit. Now, this has nothing to do with derivatives as a financial contract, so no connection to derivatives like futures, options, etc. This is a lawsuit brought against the management of the business or its directors, sitting in the board of directors, or maybe a controlling shareholder. And it's initiated by, a disgruntled shareholder, an unhappy shareholder, who takes on the position that they're acting on behalf of the company. Shareholder acting on behalf of the company, and they are forced to act on behalf of the company because so this happens if they, that is the shareholder, consider or believe that these guys, the management, the directors, the controlling, so this is management, the external shareholder, if they believe these people have failed to act in the best interest of the company, have failed to act in the company's best interests. So, in a way, that shareholder takes these people to court or files a lawsuit against them, where they deem themselves to be representatives of the company's best interest, and they're acting on behalf of the company because those guys have failed to represent the company's best interest. That's the way I understand it, but I'm not a lawyer, but that's how your book explains it, actually. Now, another one is, so a fourth mechanism from the group of shareholder corporate governance mechanisms, and this, by the way, is the biggest group, are corporate takeovers. So obviously a corporate takeover is all about affecting a change in corporate control, changes in corporate control. And once again, a few terms that you need to know in connection with this concept. First of all, a proxy contest or a proxy fight. This is where a group, right, a group of shareholders seeks to take over, assume control over the board of directors, and that group tries to persuade the shareholders of the business to vote for them or their candidates, right? So this is a proxy contest, a proxy fight, where these groups form and try to sway the others. Another one is a tender offer. This is where, instead of trying to persuade others to vote for you, you actually try to persuade other shareholders to sell you their shares. So shareholders are invited to sell their shares to a group which is seeking to gain control. A third idea is that of a hostile takeover, and this one is, of course, about trying to take over control. So it's an attempt to take over a company that has convinced the shareholders to sell their shares to you, but you're going against the existing management, because this doesn't have the approval without the approval of existing managers, approval of existing management, directors, etc. But ultimately, it's the shareholders who decide whether they want to sell their shares or not, and if they are convinced by the conditions, the price, being offered, they may vote in a way at an EGM which goes against the guidance supplied by the existing board of directors, the management. Now, the problem here with all of these corporate takeover scenarios is that typically the existing members of the board, so board members, but also the executives, the management of the company, want to preserve their jobs. That is very often their primary concern. And they may be inclined to take what are called anti-takeover measures and sort of embed them or build them in to how the company is being run. One such measure are so-called staggered boards. We discussed them, some time ago in a previous video. Staggered boards is where you don't, during one vote, ever replace the entire board of directors or vote for them afresh, because they have staggered terms. So maybe you only replace half the board in 1 year and the next half in another year, and this makes it difficult, or more difficult actually, makes it more difficult to replace the entire board. Another anti-takeover measure, which is very easy to test in a question, is something called the shareholder rights plan, but this is typically referred to as a poison pill. And this is an interesting one where shareholders can buy additional shares, so they've got the option to purchase additional shares in the company, but very importantly at a discount, so at a discounted price, if another shareholder, so this would be the acquirer, potential acquirer, buys or takes over, some percentage of the company. So if somebody else buys a certain percentage of the company, crosses a certain threshold, the remaining shareholders have the option to buy shares at a discount, which they will probably do, and therefore dilute the acquirer's voting power. Now, these anti-takeover measures simply, they don't create a bulletproof barrier to takeover, but they increase the cost of a takeover, a successful takeover, from the perspective of the bidder, and therefore make that transaction more costly and therefore less probable to happen, which doesn't mean that they are in the best interest of the existing shareholders, because sometimes it is in the interest of the shareholders just to sell their shares if the price is right. But it's the management often and the existing directors who are holding on to their power and who do not want to relinquish that. Right, the next group of mechanisms, so we are finishing, ladies and gentlemen, the shareholder mechanisms, and we're moving on to so-called creditor mechanisms now. A second group where creditors have, let's say, two mechanisms that your book talks about, two mechanisms of exercising some sort of influence on the company. One is the bond document itself, which is the bond indenture. The bond indenture, if you've studied fixed income, you will know that this is the legal contract between the issuer and investors, and it lays out the structure of the debt security, the bond. It lays out the obligations of the issuer. It lays out the rights of the bondholders, and that's the primary way of sort of enforcing these rights, or laying down what the responsibilities are. But there are also so-called creditor committees, and these get convened not from the very start, but when the issuer gets into some sort of trouble, and they only work in some jurisdictions. In others, they may not be jurisdictions. You will not find them in every place around the world. So such a committee gets established, put in place, only if the company who's the issuer of the debt files for bankruptcy. And the idea behind the mechanism is to give representation to the bondholders. So it's supposed to represent the bondholders, by the way, especially those who are most vulnerable, so especially the ones who hold unsecured debt in the whole bankruptcy process, so in bankruptcy proceedings, just to give them a more coordinated voice. Plus, there is also something known as the ad hoc committee. That name, kind of ad hoc, means it gets called in a less systematic way. It may be formed when if the company is already struggling. So it's not necessarily in a state of liquidation, right? But it's struggling, and it's not this ad hoc committee is not a sort of formal representation of all the bondholders, and therefore it speaks for everyone. But very often it's formed out of representatives of the bigger bondholders, and they may already, when the company is struggling, so it seems likely that it will get into even more trouble, it may already at this stage approach the company with some proposal for a solution, with, for example, a debt restructuring proposal, although because they don't represent all the bondholders, the company would need to still, even if they like the idea, they would need to still put it to the vote, so to speak, of the remaining bondholders and get their majority. Right, now for a really, important bunch of stakeholders, namely the board and the management. The board and management have their own set of mechanisms. So this is already the third group of stakeholders, because we began with the shareholders and shareholder mechanisms, then a brief look at creditor mechanisms, and now board and management mechanisms, and we will be focusing on so-called committees which function at board level. So within the board of directors, you will find that there are sort of committees that work on specific issues to which specific board members, specific directors have been designated or allocated. So committees are composed of selected board members. Some board members may be, may be present in more than one committee. Members, and the role of the committees is to, debate over, consider, review, monitor various matters which are within their sort of mandate. And there may be many different committees. It depends on the profile and complexity of the company itself, but you'll typically find three sort of core committees that are always present. The most established one is something called the Audit Committee. Now, it is best practice that the Audit Committee should be composed of independent directors only. You may remember that in a previous video when we introduced the board, we said that independent directors exist, and these are people who don't have really any material connection with the company. They're not a major shareholder, they're not an executive, etc. This committee, it's also best practice, should include at least one member, but more is better, with an accounting or financial management background, which actually makes a lot of sense, because they work on matters relating to financial reporting. So it would be good if they know what they're sort of doing here. So what is the job of the Audit Committee then, of this body? They monitor, so the Audit Committee monitors the company's financial reporting process. So they don't interfere with the actual production of the financial statements or the numbers, but they kind of look at the validity of the whole process, including, and this is where accounting background or financial management background really comes in handy, this also includes the choice of accounting policies. Sometimes, a company will have a choice with regard to which approach to use to value something. If you've watched a video on, for example, on how financial instruments are accounted for within FSA, financial statements analysis, you will know that a bond, just to name one example, may be accounted for in 3 different ways, depending on the way it is classified: at amortized cost, at fair value via operating other comprehensive income, or at fair value via P&L. And that's an accounting choice that you need to make, and it's very important, or it's very significant for the balance sheet and the P&L results. Now, what they also do, this audit committee, is it supervises, so kind of oversees the internal audit function. Most businesses will have a division or a team called internal audit, and especially so as to ensure that internal audit's independence and competence. So internal audit are the people who work for the company, but they check what the others are doing, as opposed to external auditors who check but don't work for the company. And they, once again, we're talking about the audit committee, they also recommend the independent external auditor, who to choose for this job, which company to choose, and their remuneration, how much they should be getting. Plus, they actually hold regular meetings with the external auditor, hold meetings with the auditor. Remember that the auditor's job is to verify whether the financial statements produced by the company are sort of fair and give a proper representation of what's going on. However, the financial statements are prepared by management and signed off by directors. So when auditors have concerns, they shouldn't go to the directors and the management to voice them. They go to the audit committee. They don't speak to the management, they speak to the audit committee. Well, they also speak to the management on smaller matters, but when there is some fundamental issue, you go to the audit committee to discuss matters. Now, another important committee of the 3 that are really critical for your success in this section of the exam is the nominating. This is often known as the Nominations or Governance Committee. Okay, its job is to evaluate candidates for director positions, and it also oversees the entire election process of directors. They search for suitable candidates, but also sets the criteria for that search. For example, what skills are we looking for, what experience, what background, and their job should ideally, be done in such a way as to aim for what we would call a balanced board, bringing to the table different perspectives, different experiences, etc., etc. So let me just state that over here, best practice would also be for these, for the members of the nominating or governance committee to also be independent directors only. Okay. Now, aside from functions or roles, activities that are associated with the board membership election process. They're also going to be responsible for governance topics. So things like a corporate governance code, charters, so like the rules for the board and the various committees. After all, they need to function based on some set of guidelines and principles, something like a code of ethics for the entire company, and policies on ideas like, on concepts like the conflict of interest, which, at board level often materialize, things like that board members, directors should disclose related party transactions if, for example, a member of their family is doing business with this company. That can create either true conflict of interest or at least a perception of such conflict. So these things need to be disclosed, and it's the nominating / governance committee that is responsible for setting the rules under which this happens. Okay, and for the third committee, the final of the big three, we've got something called the compensation / remuneration committee. And this one's a bit easier in the sense of being much more plain in what it does. It develops and proposes remuneration policies, for the directors and key members of management, so the key executives, typically, the C-level executives, the chief of something executives. And of course, the idea is to propose policies, typically, that do a good job in aligning the interests of these directors and executives with the interests of the shareholders. But they also, they develop the policies which including performance criteria for evaluation. Because a lot of the compensation will typically be performance-based. Once again, it's best practice, but also in many places a legal requirement. So may be a legal requirement that this committee is composed of independent directors only, right? Not everywhere this is a legal requirement, but in some countries it is. Now, as you will appreciate, compensation policies and compensation plans, typically, especially for the directors and the chief and the top executives, typically include an element of variable pay, typically include a variable component. This is typically granted as shares or stock options. And of course, this element, the shares given and the stock options, are going to be related to share price performance. Hence, hence variability here, because it's not a fixed amount of cash that you receive. So the idea is that this type of variable compensation should encourage alignment with shareholder interests to make the share price growth, but at the same time should discourage so-called short-term thinking, so short-termism, and excessive risk-taking. Because as we mentioned before, if you give somebody stock options, that only become really valuable if the share price rises above a certain level. Directors may be inclined to do something risky that may push the company's share price in that direction, because if it doesn't happen, their stock options do not pull them down in any way and make them suffer. So it's a sort of one-way ticket, which, if we're lucky, will turn out to be very valuable. So in order to discourage short-term thinking and excessive risk-taking in the short term, very often these share awards or these option awards have a vesting period, i.e. they're not immediately exercisable, or you can't really get those options, those shares yet. They have a so-called vesting period, and they vest over a period of several years. Sometimes they vest only when the executive retires, or the director retires, and the aim of such deferral or delay is that this compensation then, is, like I said, delayed until those long-term objectives of the company are reached. But it's not a short-term thing. And let's just note that in recent times, so to speak, it's become more and more increasingly popular, or increasingly the norm, to consult executive pay and director pay with shareholders. So consultation with shareholders over remuneration matters has materialized or taken the form of what your book calls say on pay voting at the AGM, where shareholders get to vote on these sort of compensation packages or compensation proposals. And let's just, maybe at the very bottom of the page here, say that there could be additional committees as well, and there often are, often very much industry specific. For example, and this is the industry dependent, the example given by your book is that in the financial services industry, you will typically have a very powerful and strong committee in terms of its powers, called the Risk Committee, which you'll definitely find in banks, in banking, in the banking industry. Okay. And this is a committee that sets the risk profile of the business, the risk appetite, risk governance policies, and so on. Right, so this was the board and management mechanisms. We've already covered these. So previously we had shareholders, creditor mechanisms, now board and management. So just, three final groups, although of stakeholders, but much smaller in terms of the content. Employer mechanisms for exercising sort of their corporate governance roles. How are employee rights ultimately protected and enforced? Well, they are protected primarily via the individual contracts that everybody has with their employer, right? You sign a contract. That gives you certain rights and, of course, creates certain obligations. Sometimes those individual contracts are in some way a function of union membership and the fact that unions are present and they negotiate these contracts on behalf of a group of union members. And of course there are local labor laws, obviously very different from country to country. And let's also add that in some countries, for example in Germany, I think in Austria as well, and in some Scandinavian countries. I pointed up because the Scandinavian countries are north of where I am. Employees or employee representatives are also represented on the board of directors. So that's another, governance mechanism. At this point, the curriculum also mentions something called ESOP. These are employee stock ownership plans. So this is obviously a plan for granting, for the giving, for granting shares to the employees. And this once again has the role of aligning the interests of the employees, not just the directors and the top executives, but also a sort of mid-management, lower management, and sometimes just ordinary employees with the interests of the shareholders. Okay, that ends the employee mechanisms. Now we move on to customer and supplier mechanisms, and really there isn't a lot of substantial things to say here, apart from the fact that the relationship between the company, between the business and its customers and suppliers will typically be set out in a contract, which once again specifies the rights and obligations. But here your book says that customers and suppliers, I think especially customers, can, and increasingly do so, use social media to voice their interests, to voice concerns, especially when they're dissatisfied with, for example, the quality of service, voice their interests. And that is a force to reckon with, or a mechanism for governance to bear in mind, right? Now, the final stakeholder group is the government. So your book finally talks about so-called government mechanisms. Very shortly here, it says, well, laws and regulations are the primary mechanism via which the government interacts with business, and in some countries at least, it may also impose some corporate governance code onto companies, in some countries at least. So increasingly, governments are, let's say, meddling or interfering with how companies conduct their corporate governance, trying to impose certain best practices. Shooting this in 2024, there's a lot of talk now about this happening in Japan, where the government is trying to force Japanese companies to change their corporate governance rules in a certain directions. So corporate governance codes are guidelines for at least publicly traded businesses, publicly traded companies, not necessarily for privately held ones. And the idea is, you can't ultimately force a company to act in a, to adjust its way of behavior sort of 100%, but a common theme is something referred to as comply or explain. And what we mean by this is that the company must inform it. We're talking about publicly traded businesses, so it must disclose, whether it's adopted the guidelines from that corporate governance code, adoption of those guidelines, or if they haven't, explain why it chose not to do so. Which obviously puts pressure on it to actually comply, because typically trying to explain why you haven't is not going to be an easy task.